There's something unmistakable about the silhouette of a Dark Souls boss. Even from a distance, you can tell who you're about to fight just from the way that their armor cuts through the air. I like to think that's because armor isn't just protective gear in these games, it's identity made solid. Each and every soul bearer stands so individually from the last simply because of what they're wearing. The curve of a pauldron or even the way a robe has rotted away, these are all deliberate layered details. Now, there's hundreds of bosses to choose from over the course of the entire franchise, but I have chosen a few to look at closely. Also, just as a note, I use the word armor because the bosses in these games were all kinds of things, and I think it's just better if I refer to their garments as armor instead of clothes or leather or, whatever they're wearing. Also, I won't be deferring to any weaponry or shields due to them not being armor, but instead weapons and shields. So yes, I know that weapons and great shields and the like really help to convey further, but I feel like armor can also speak on its own as a completely separate being. Standing at the gates of Sen's fortress, the Iron Golem is literally armor given life. It's a suit without a physical presence inside, which makes its design brilliant. The silhouette is a thick and almost blocky kind of silhouette with overlapping iron plates that is fairly reminiscent of medieval Germanic full plate, and that has been overly exaggerated to impossible proportions. Iron Golem's armor is very well worn despite its lifeless nature, but what is most interesting to me is that its lower half is the most worn half and not the top side. Obviously, the top side shows signs of age, but the legs in particular have been scratched and scraped to death, which is a very obvious sign of every single contender to enter Sen's fortress and ultimately fail. As a whole, Iron Golem just looks incredibly heavy. Even if you shrunk the armor down to a human size, I personally feel it would look still just as heavy. It wouldn't sit on the body the same way Havel's armor does, for instance. It's clear that this is a product of engineering rather than craftsmanship. The golem itself is slow and it has this sweeping combat style which entirely focuses on the weight and mass of the armor. This armor is, and never has been, made for the opponent to face victory. It is made to give you an incredibly difficult time. The armor here is the boss. Remove the metal and there's literally nothing left. Ornstein's armor is easily one of the most iconic in the entire series. It's ornate but lean, gilded with a dull gold that impresses without ever feeling gaudy. His silhouette is sharp and intentionally elongated, the plumed helm with the extended face, flared shoulders paired with the kilt-like legs that purposely don't wrap all the way around to prevent a stocky appearance. If I could guess, I would say Ornstein's design pulls from late medieval jousting plate and mixes it with feline, but also draconic motifs. This scale-like appearance is etching onto the breastplate, and wing-like flanges on the pauldrons only to be mixed in with that leonine helm crest and a mane-esque plume. This all, of course, neatly ties back to his role as the captain of Gwyn's 4 knights. Lions are king of the jungles, captains are king of their team, and all of that stuff. And his title as a dragonslayer. His armor both echoes the dragons he slew, but also his stature as a captain. It's very clearly designed for agility. There's no flowing decorative cape, no heavy chainmail, just clean, defined lines and interlocking plates that allow for free movement of limbs. The armor overall conveys the speed of a lion, but the terror of a dragon. His armor tells you every single thing about him before he even moves. This includes both his future and his past. Smough is Ornstein's perfect opposite. His armor is grotesquely oversized, swollen with bulbous curves and deep ridges like he ate far more than he could handle. Every inch of his armor is embossed with flourishes to symbolize a possible great pride that Smough has for his title as executioner. It's deliberately ill-fitting. Smough himself is actually pretty muscular, as the concept art implies. The rotund shape is akin to the greed Smough displayed alongside that aforementioned pride when executing his victims. Not only did he execute a vast number of people, but he also ate them. And that armor showcases the gluttony of a person who never speaks a single word. In fact, you don't have to read a single word of the law to know that Smough is an incredibly bad person, because the armor does all of that reading and speaking for you. A rejected executioner who wanted to join Gwyn's knights but was deemed too grotesque. I've always thought that his armor makes him look like a piece of ceremonial architecture that learned to move, rather than a physical being, unlike Ornstein's. By the time you meet him, Gwyn is easily the most hollow being in the entirety of Lordran. But his armor seems to still hold itself together to the best of its ability. His mantle is missing, most likely burnt and swallowed by the fire, but the rest of his armor is still standing as regal as it possibly can. You can see the gold plate under the robe and his overly pointed crown that further confirms his fragility as king. Despite being inside a literal kiln for hundreds of years, his armor is slightly torn at the hems at most. There's no overly charred gold, no burnt up robes, nothing to really signify that he is literally standing in a bowl of fire. And I think that's the tragedy. You can clearly see the king that he was. Perhaps his desperate search for what it meant to be king followed him into the kiln and teased him, refusing to burn up his armor as he hollowed as if he was just another pitiful soul, when all of his royal children never knew what it meant to go hollow. This isn't a stately monarch, this is a dry husk, still trying to be what it once was. The kiln swallowed Gwyn up and laughed at him, and I think this is deflected quite well in his armor. It is no secret that Artorias' armor is a masterpiece of storytelling. His armor is elegant but absolutely destroyed. Glowing blue cape shredded to tatters, the chainmail around his legs has been broken. A difficult feat when you consider chainmail was preferred for its incredible durability. And what was once clean silver plate has been rusted and corrupted with abyss. Despite the destruction, small remnants of ornate filigree on his helm peek through in this clear, untarnished, pristine white. It's very obviously knightly gear turned into a newfound relic, and that contrast is quite heartbreaking. My favourite thing about Artorias' armour has always been that the most disrepair is on the left side of his body, as he attempted to fight the abyss with a great shield that actually took most of the damage. It was so piled with abyss that the weight of that broke his arm entirely. Whilst none of this is obvious from the second you walk into the fog gate, what is obvious is the wreckage being most prevalent on the left-hand side, making even the most brainless of players able to understand that clearly a series of unfortunate events took place. To go even further, the Abyss has famously taken on a few colours within the Dark Souls franchise. The Abyss in and within itself doesn't have a factual, pure, outright colour, but it can manifest itself to be black, purple, pure white, and blue. With this in mind, was the blue of Artorias' armour meant to signify regality or the fate that followed him into an early grave? Dark Souls 2 has some incredible armor designs, and the Pursuers is one of the first examples that the player comes into contact with. Overall, his armor is stock standard dark steel with ragged edges, as any knight should have, but then the faces of hollows literally trying to stretch their way out of pure refined steel are made clear. Funnily enough, the misleading blandness of his armor helps to confirm his identity as a completely foreign being, like he's always arriving from somewhere else, and I think that helps to sell that this is a knight indeed, but it's also the embodiment of punishment. The lack of any filigree or regalia, so you couldn't even guess his origin even if you wanted to, because there is literally nothing that signifies who he is. All of those faces screaming at you from his chestplate are pursuing freedom, just as he himself pursues the player. Because Looking Last Night was the boss presented to journalists at E3 2013, he has one of the most visually striking designs in the game. His armor is perfect mirror-polished silver with an almost obsessive-compulsive feel to it, with just how acutely pristine it is. I think this creates an uncanny sense of artificiality, like a living statue. The faces on each side of his helmet give off this idea that in some odd way, he is more than one being. He's a mass of personalities coming together to form a collective. Real world-wise, Looking Last Night's armor reminds me of the Renaissance, where armor was built for ceremony more than it was war. Armor became a statement piece rather than a practical piece. And the amount of detail on his plate is immense and is absolutely not practical in any sense. The chestplate is lacking in any interlocking craftsmanship, meaning that most of his movement is purely in his arms, which do have interlocking parts. There's also this religious motif that I get from Looking Last Night. I myself am not religious, but I do know Jesus Christ when I see him. Please do let me know if I am wrong. But the barbs over his helm and the shoulders, and I know I said I wouldn't, but it is on his weaponry, and the biblical wings on his back just scream some kind of Christian side. Of course, this is absolutely completely subjective, but overall, I think Looking Last Night has armor that one way or another is meant to overwhelm you with awe or render you speechless instead of intimidate you or scare you. Maybe this is why he's guarding the king, because somebody who should be shrouded in all kinds of otherworldly feelings, such as a king, should accurately be guarded by somebody who feels very far out of humanity's reach. These two are fascinating beings because they're mirror images of each other. The Watcher wears silver armor with delicate flowing lines and this faint blue sheen, while the Defender wears outwardly darker, mightier steel with gold trim, and it's heavier and it's blockier overall. The Watcher set is almost elven in its design. It's very elegant and swift, while the Defender's is stoic and knightly and super masculine. This may sound funny, but I think the contrast reflects their roles perfectly. There is one to watch and one to defend. One has armor built for taking the beating of those who seek to usurp, and the other has armor made for agility, always needing to move or spy or oversee the throne. It's balance of power embodied, light and dark, speed and strength, and the reinforced idea that two halves will always form one whole. I've always thought they're kind of like chess pieces, the king and queen respectively. The king, Defender, symbolizes authority whilst being one of the most vulnerable pieces, and the entire game's goal, as its safety is paramount, requiring it to be protected. The Defender is a force to be reckoned with, but he can't stand alone due to his importance. The game is over if the king is lost, which is why you must play with the queen, rook, and any other key parts alongside it. The queen, Watcher, represents foresight and flexibility, as it is the most mobile and commanding piece. The king and the queen, Watcher and Defender, must work in tandem to properly showcase the duality they represent. A game of chess is not over if the queen is lost, as ultimately the king is the focus, but losing the queen can put you at a considerable disadvantage. This is very well proven, as if you take down Watcher, Defender is quite easily killable. The Burnt Ivory King's armor is magnificent in many ways. Once it was a brilliant ivory to complement the snow of Ilium Lois that has now been scorched by the flame of that which overcame Lost Izalith. His poor armor has literally been through hellfire and back. I think his armor has a measured dignity to it. Unlike other bosses that possess destroyed armor sets, it seems like the Burnt Ivory King is the only one that stands tall and, importantly, proud, with the same level of nobility he had before he entered into the Great Swan. Unlike Gwyn, who lost his mantle, or Vendrick, who shed himself entirely, all parts of the Ivory King's armor are displayed proudly as they can, trying its best to shine through the soot and char. On the note of kings, I would say that the only true image of him being royal is the mantle. His helm is pointed, but those points don't go around the hem, so you could easily mistake it to just be decorative choice. His armor is also very akin to his Knights of Ilium Lois, as in they are pretty much identical aside from the headpiece, which has always led me to think that he is quite a humble king, which is probably why he's the only king in Dark Souls' history to not be so broken beyond repair that you can only feel bad for him. Granted, he is still a boss at the end of the day, but there's no denying that his armor alludes to quite the impressive force of a man. What I have always enjoyed is that the Abyss Watcher's colour and materials of choice is this ragged red with leather instead of steel, when their founder, Kieran, and influence artorias so proudly wore blue and silver. They wear leather under a very minor amount of steel plate, crowned with wide brim hats that are so overtly artorias in design instead of helmets. The Abyss Watchers are adorned for battle and battle only. Too much steel would prevent the level of movement they require and would wear down incredibly fast as a byproduct of that. But then you could assume that Kieran refused to have them wear steel entirely because she found it pointless. The Abyss swallowed the chainmail and steel of Artorias just as quickly as it would engulf leather. The overall appearance of the Abyss Watchers is just pure grime. They have literally been fighting for forever, and not just fighting the Abyss, but also themselves as a collective. What is most interesting about the Abyss Watcher's armor is that the left-hand side is the most covered with steel, notably on the most important parts of the arms, the shoulder and the wrist. If you suffer major injury to either of these areas, the damage is very rarely easily to overcome. For example, if you faced a force so impactful that it shattered the shield you were holding, that impact would first travel to your wrist and then up into your shoulder. The wrist and shoulder must work in tandem when handling objects, as you control the direction with your wrist and the movement of it with your shoulder. The Abyss Watcher's armor says one thing and one thing only. We are many things in many ways and a byproduct of many things, but we only have a singular goal. The Abyss must die. Sulyvahn's armor is decadent and sinister. Layers and layers of obnoxious gold jewelry over his pope robes and a crown that mocks the entire world around him with cruel hooked points. The sinister side comes from his complete erasure of his face with the help of a chainmail mask, convoluted with branches that slink across the front. It's the perfect visual for a tyrant who claimed himself both god and king. The ecclesiastical robe marks him as a self-anointed royalty, whilst the secular crown contradicts that point entirely. I personally think that every single thing Pontiff Sulyvahn has done and will do, right down to the way he chooses to showcase himself, is done with full attention. His armor is vanity weaponized, meant to manipulate the beings he seeks to malform to believe that Pontiff is someone far more important than they could ever possibly conceive. Upon first meeting, I wouldn't say that Pontiff's armor is outright intimidating, but it's unmistakable that the crown, followed by what should be humble pontiff attire, leads you to wonder about him, which is exactly what Sulyvahn wants. Pontiff Sulyvahn wants to be in every possible crevice of Lothric and showcased in any possible emotion, and your thoughts aren't shy of that. Like the Iron Golem, Dragonslayer armor is devoid of a physical being, but it is also very obviously Ornstein's discarded armor, but it's now heavier and battered, and interestingly lacking that same level of grace that Dragonslayer Ornstein himself had. The gold has darkened, and the plume has been matted and knotted with a misshaped chestplate protruding out like Smough's once did. The silhouette is bulkier and more monstrous than the captain of the Four Knights, which is an obvious sign that the pilgrim butterflies who are puppeteering it probably don't really have any idea how it should be properly utilized. This would also explain the stark difference in the helmet specifically. Where Ornstein was leonine in his face, the Dragonslayer armor chooses to remove the faceplate in its entirety because identity cannot be replicated no matter how fine you make the details. However, what is odd is that the pilgrim butterflies have given the armor a more draconic appearance despite Ornstein's displaying both values of feline and draconic equally. The indented ridges of the newly found armor are so akin to not the purebred dragons of Lothric, but instead the wyverns found all across the game. Dragonslayer armor is not wielded by something dead nor alive, but by something most definitely alien. Whilst it looks and feels unnatural, it's also something entirely new, and that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. But then again, you have to wonder if the player ever really knew Ornstein at all, despite his armor. In Lordran, he is an illusion, and in Lothric, only his armor remains, leading us to wonder if he is out there somewhere and what his real nature is like. Maybe he's hiding somewhere in the clouds. I don't suppose we'll ever know. Gundyr's armor has to absolutely take influence from Roman gladiators. The way the chestplate has that pectoral design, and even the design of his leg piece, just all reminds me of a gladiator. Although this may very well be the intention, as Gundyr is the judge of Fireling Shrine. If you can't take down Gundyr, then you absolutely can't take down Soul of Cinder. There is dried up blood all over Gundyr's armor, reaching to his helmet right down to his toes, which is an excellent way to further convey to the player that this is a man that is like an unrefined ruler, which makes the ruined armor feel like a last trace of a failed champion. Unfortunately, when it comes to Udex Gundyr, a lot of it is lost to cut content and his doomed fate to be a tutorial boss instead of Yorm. So the ominous presence of his helmet containing a crown and the two unknown faces on either side of his shoulder plate leaves much to be desired. I will say that I do think Gundyr was heavily inspired by Old King Doran from Demon's Souls, which also might be why I see such profound gladiator within him, and also why their fates are so, whilst not entirely, similar in nature. Soul of Cinder's armor is a patchwork of all the Lords of Cinder, and so its design is genius with just how ambiguous it is. It doesn't reflect any one person who linked the flame. It has no regalia of any king, nor a crown of any obvious person. Because it isn't a person, it's everyone who linked the fire, no matter what way they did it. The armor sells that idea. It's generic and specific all at once, like a amalgam. This isn't a person, the suit is completely hollow inside. It's the idea of kingship itself, and so it must present itself to be as far removed from any one being as it can. When you take a close look at Soul of Cinder, its armor is actually pretty boring, aside from the helmet that has a literal skull indented into the front, and that's what makes it so good. I personally think that Soul of Cinder being so indistinguishable neatly ties into the sheer hopelessness Dark Souls 3 spends so long portraying. However, the fact that the armor is so simple helps to include the player in that blandness, because we as the player in Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 did indeed link the flame, and each and every one of us wore something different when we did so. Soul of Cinder's choice to manifest itself as unimportant helps you to take a look at the armor and think, oh, I'm included in that amalgamation too. Across the Dark Souls trilogy, boss armor evolves and devolves like a language. Early designs in Dark Souls 1 are very much about archetypes, knights, demons, and dragons, and then in 2 they become more ornate and symbolic, reflecting crumbling kingdoms and personal tragedies. And then by 3 they've decayed into ghosts of themselves using armor as memory. What makes them unforgettable isn't just the artistry, it's that these designs make you feel who these characters are before they ever even swing a weapon. They tell entire epics in rust and silk, in broken steel chestplates and burning mantles. From Software's genius is that the armor never just protects you, it speaks for both you and the bosses you're fighting. I think that's why these figures stick close in our minds. We don't just fight them, we read them, and in their clothing we catch a glimpse of entire worlds falling apart. Until next time, praise the sun, and take Fashion Souls a bit more seriously.
Don't you dare let yourself go hollow, lest my time spent on you be wasted.